Nerves. Impulses of nerves include potassium and sodium ions. Sodium rushes inside the nerve cell from an action potential shown in the figure, and potassium rushes outside, helping to prepare the nerve to reset for the next impulse. Now, the theory is that if some of the sodium or potassium ions are depleted or lost during rushing in and out of the nerve, then this may cause less sodium and less potassium ions. At some point, this may mean that there is not enough ions to complete a contraction, and a loss of potassium ions has a negative effect on the excitability and causes the speed of the impulse to be slower or reduced, therefore inducing fatigue. Another possible cause of neuromuscular fatigue is a depletion of ACH, acetylcholine, at the neuromuscular junction. ACH is extremely important and is used to transfer the nerve impulses across the neuromuscular junction or synaptic membrane to provide a contraction. However, if there is an insufficient amount of ACH, this will mean that a contraction will not take place, as it works on an all or nothing approach, meaning that it will only contract if there is ACH. Cholinesterase is another fatigue cause, which could be a depletion of the enzyme cholinesterase. It is an enzyme that breaks down the ACH after and prepares it to go again. In order for another contraction to take place for the body, ACH has to be cleared from the synaptic cleft by cholinesterase. However, if there is too much ACH at this point or too little cholinesterase, then a muscle contraction cannot take place, as ACH cannot be taken away. In the diagram on the left, you can see that it shows the level of exercise intensity and the contribution to total energy. It shows that at low intensities, more specifically at 20%, labeled low intensity, the main contribution to total energy is coming from fats at around 80% and carbs at around 20%. However, we can see in the graph that as the exercise increases, the contribution of carbs and fats to total energy changes. At medium intensity, it shows that both carbs and fats are similar and around equal in total contribution. However, once the intensity increases to around 90%, you can see that the dominant contributor to energy is carbohydrates at about 80% and fats 20%. This tells us that at lower intensities, such as submaximal exercise like a marathon, the dominant contributor to energy is fats, whereas at higher intensity like a Wingate test or a 100-meter sprint, the main source of energy and contributor is CHO. The figure on the right shows the energy sources ATP, PC, carbohydrates, fats and protein. It shows the storage sites and also the approximate amount of energy in kilocalories that each source gives us. The ATP PC gives us about 5 kilocalories. We know that it's going to be a small amount of energy as it's a very high intensity and immediate source of energy. However, carbohydrates, which has a storage sites blood glucose, liver glycogen and muscle glycogen, has 1,500 kilocalories in the muscle. Whilst comparing the approximate energy in kilocalories, you can see that the fat stores and sources give us the most amount of energy at 80,000 plus kilocalories in adipose tissue, and still 2,500 kilocalories of energy in muscle triglycerides. This shows that there is a lot of energy that can be gained from fats. Protein is the final and the only storage site, is muscle protein, which is not ideal to be used by performers as it can decrease the amount of muscle they have. It can produce around 30,000 kilocalories of energy, however you would be burning muscle if you were to do this. The graph tells us that the most effective and abundant source of energy is fats, followed by protein, carbs, then the ATP-PC. They're used by athletes in order to cool the body right down before a long distance event like a marathon. This is done by taking a slushy, for example, or wearing a cooling vest. The reasons why athletes do this is to prevent the body temperature from rising too high. If the body temperature rises too rapidly, this can cause a decrease in performance, as the body cannot work properly at very high temperatures, and also helps to reduce the chance of serious injuries and illnesses from hyperthermia, where the body becomes too hot. This was talked about earlier in the waste products of submaximal exercise. You can see here in the graph on the left hand side. In the top part of the graph, it shows temperature along the left hand side, and then 3 groups: the control group, the preheating, which got heated before the exercise, and then the pre-cooling group. It showed The control group stayed around just under 37 degrees, and the pre-cooling group around 35 to 36 degrees, and the heating group rose to about 37.5 degrees. As the exercise continued, you can see that the pre-cooling group took longer to rise up to a higher body temperature in comparison to that of the preheating. The preheating group's body temperature rose rapidly, whereas the pre-cooling group took much longer to reach a higher body temperature. And this is good for athletes because it means that they can work for longer, and you can see that in the graph that they were able to work for longer. And this means that they're less likely to have a worse performance, and also less chance of serious risks like hypothermia. And in the bottom left graph, you can see that it is skin temperature, and you can see that over time the skin temperature rises of the pre-cooling to about 34 degrees after 55 minutes, whereas the preheating group stayed at around 36 degrees the whole time. And we know that the body temperature or the skin temperature being too high is not ideal for exercising for long durations. On the graph on the right is showing carb loading. Now, carb loading is a method used by athletes before long distance submaximal exercise in order to prevent glucose and glycogen depletion. And the graph shows that along the bottom it shows the days, and the first 4 days were carbo depleting. So day 1 shows the normal amount of carbs that the athlete was eating, around 80 muscle glycogen millimoles. But then in carbo depleting, so the athlete would not eat any carbs or try to eat as little as possible for 3 days, as you can see, day 2, 3 and 4, and they would exercise a lot. Now this would mean that there's almost no glycogen, there's little carbohydrates being intaken, and also exercise to use up all of those carbs. This means that when the athlete will take in carbs and start to carb load, the body will hold on to these carbs and store them. And you can see that the muscle glycogen millimoles went from being around 80 millimoles to then when the athlete started carbo loading, it rose rapidly to 120, then on day 7, just before the event, to 150 muscle glycogen millimoles. Now in these carbo loading days, the athlete wouldn't exercise, and the reason for this is they don't want to use up the carbs that they've done in the carbo loading stage, so that they have a maximum amount before starting the event. So the main reason for carbo loading is so that they have a higher amount of muscle glycogen before starting the event than they would have before if they didn't carbo load.